Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyrr Zelensky is due at the United Nations in New York soon, where he'll be addressing the General Assembly. He'll be speaking to world leaders after joining a session of the Security Council on Tuesday. He's trying to boost U.S. support for Ukraine, which is struggling 2.5 years into Russia's invasion.
Dozens were injured during the latest Russian strike on Kharkiv. Bombs hit an apartment block, a bakery and a stadium. Only 30 kilometers from the Russian border, the city has been a regular target since the war began. Meanwhile, President Volodymyrr Zelensky is in the United States to meet world leaders at the UN General Assembly meeting. Addressing the UN Security Council, Zelensky emphasized the need for more support for Ukraine.
One day in this hall, it will surely be said that Russia's war against Ukraine has ended, not frozen, not paused, not forgotten, truly ended. And this will happen not because someone got tired of the war, not because someone traded something with Putin. Russia's war against Ukraine will end because the UN Charter will war.
Zelensky has brought what he is calling a victory plan to present to US President Joe Biden, how he thinks the war could be brought to an end with more help from the West. But US support for Ukraine could have a time limit. Biden was clear on his promise during his final speech to the UN General Assembly as president.
We cannot grow weary. We cannot look away. And we will not let up on our support for Ukraine. Not until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace in the UN Charter.
But Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump struck a more cynical tone during a speech in Georgia.
Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine, and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out. I watched him. We will win, we will. He's been saying that for 3 years.
The outcome of the US elections in November could decide whether Ukraine can still rely on the United States for crucial military and financial aid as it continues its fight against Russia.
Let's get the perspective from the US as well as from Ukraine. I'm joined now by DW correspondents Janelle Dumalaon at the UN headquarters and Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv. Janelle, let me start with you. Yesterday, the big focus was on the Middle East. Today, can we expect that to shift to Ukraine?
Yes, Nimisha, it's day 2 of this high-level debate week at the UN General Assembly. And I have to say, the various crises from the Middle East to Ukraine still very much dominate the agenda. So as you said there earlier, we're expecting Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky to speak shortly following the Czech Republic. He already spoke last night at the UN Security Council, making the case in front of this 15-country grouping that Russia should be, quote, forced into peace. We're expecting a similar tenor from him today, perhaps more details as to his yet to be completely unveiled plan, what he has been calling his victory plan. As for President Biden, Ukraine very much remains on his agenda as well. Later today, he is convening a group of world leaders to have a meeting focused on Ukrainian reconstruction. Beyond that, we're also looking tonight to an emergency meeting by the UN Security Council on Lebanon, on the fighting in Lebanon. That is an emergency meeting convened by France. So you can see that the focus still very much here is on conflict and this assembly's power to address those conflicts, or perhaps more fitting, the limits to that power in addressing these conflicts.
Matthias, clearly a lot on the UN's plate there, but we are anticipating Zelensky to speak soon. Do we know any more about what exactly he's supposed to cover today?
If yesterday's speech is any indication, the message that he has for the UN is that the territorial integrity of Ukraine is not up for negotiations. We know that there has been a new initiative by Brazil and China to set up a new framework for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, and that this framework does not mention at all the territorial integrity or any outcome for Ukraine. That has, of course, been noticed here in Ukraine. So the message that he has for the UN, for the broader international community, is that the UN Charter must be abided to, and that means that the goal of any negotiation process, the outcome of the war, has to be a restoration of the territorial integrity, and that Russia must not succeed with its breach of the UN Charter. The other message, of course, that he's brought to the US, but that is one more for the allies, is that they need to do more to strengthen Ukraine, to put it into a position to achieve these goals militarily or in negotiations where it will needs to be in a stronger position, or maybe a combination of both.
Chanel, let me come back to you. We heard clearly outlined there what Zelensky wants. Is he likely to get it?
You know, that is not, as of the moment, very clear. We actually heard a few days ago from the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. She had been briefed on some aspects of Zelensky's plan, and she said that the plan could work. However, it's worth pointing out that Zelensky is unlikely to get all that he wants. For example, a senior White House official briefing reporters yesterday told us that Biden's position on whether to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia, that Biden's position on that matter has remained unchanged. However, Biden is still at pains to prove that the U.S. still very much stands by the side of Ukraine. An announcement is expected later today of another military aid package worth $375 million. They'll be sending cluster bombs, artillery, rockets, and armored vehicles. So as such, that is to give Zelensky something that is so that he will be able to say that he has not walked away empty-handed, but perhaps without some key concessions that he very much did want to get.
And that was DW's Chanel Dumalaon in New York and Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv. Thank you so much for your reporting. For more, let's bring in Frank Ledwidge, Senior Lecturer in War Studies at Portsmouth University. He joins us now from Oxford. Welcome back to DW, Frank. As we just heard there at the end of that report, Zelensky is on a mission in the US to get support that he says is the only way to win the war. Do you agree with that assessment?
Good afternoon, Namisha. You mentioned or quoted in that excellent report two presidents. So I'm going to give you a third, President Pavel of the Czech Republic, himself a former general and extremely pro-Ukraine. And he says it's unrealistic to hope that the war is going to end with Ukrainian victory in the next weeks or months. And at some point, Ukraine is going, essentially, he hints very strongly, Ukraine is going to have to give up land. And I think that's absolutely true. And we are moving towards, I think, a situation where matters are becoming more critical to Ukraine every week, indeed every day. Today, for example, it looks as if they're going to lose the fortress town of Vuhledar in the south on that front that was mentioned in the war. So are things, is now today critical? No. Is next week? It'll be more so, and so on. I think we are, though, in the strategic sense, at a tipping point.
You mentioned the tipping point and the fact that the outlook for Zelensky and Ukraine getting his way does seem to be bleak, according to you. Zelensky has also said Russia can only be forced into peace. So is your sense that Ukraine's push into Russian territory not really putting any pressure on Putin then?
It was a gamble. It was a gamble possibly worth taking. However, what the Ukrainians have done is fix themselves into Russia. Now they have to defend that territory with troops that would have been far better used in the south. Now, the gamble, of course, was that Russia would take the bait, as it were, and move some of their better units, or many of them, to retake a fairly remote part of Russia. And they have not done that. Instead, what's happened is Ukraine has now withdrawn forces from the south, made it even weaker than before, and now have to defend that area in Russia. So the gamble has failed. Now, what they do about that, we will see. I suspect they'll try to hold on to it. But as the report said there, the Ukrainians are overextended. So are the Russians. But the Ukrainians face the problem that they are 1/4 or less of the population, and they have perhaps even stronger or even more difficult situation with respect to recruiting and manpower. And that's the centre of gravity militarily in this war.
So you mentioned failed gambles there. Another push that Zelensky and Ukraine have continuously been making is that permission to use long-range missiles in Russia. We expect to see that once again from Zelensky in the US right now. What are his chances of success and of things changing?
Well, who knows what's going on in the chancelleries of the US. Certainly the UK is pushing for this. The UK's problems are they don't have many of these missiles. And that's important because the strike density, which is to say the numbers of missiles to be used, is important. Just to give you some context, to take Serbia out of the war in 1999, a tiny country by comparison, it took 10,000 airstrikes. Now, there's nothing like that available to the Ukrainians. They could well exercise some coercion, but it's very unlikely at the strategic level, that is to say the really important level, that a few missiles lobbed into Western Russia will make a major difference to the war itself. What it could do, of course, is encourage some form of escalation. And that, of course, is what is restraining Biden's hand, I suspect.
Frank Letwich, thank you so much again for your very clear analysis.
Thank you, ma'am.